Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my fifth and final primer of this spring split season. It is the LTA North's time to get their power rankings and primer video. I'm super excited to go over the LTA North. There's obviously a lot to talk about. I think the top of the standings is super congested in terms of the expectations for a lot of these teams, and there are some interesting players that are on teams that are near the bottom of the standings that I think theoretically could get better as we move into the spring split. Not to mention, we have a very interesting format to talk about that I actually like quite a bit. It's not the best format that's ever been invented, but it's certainly better than a lot of the other regions who are overcomplicating the process. I feel like everything here kind of makes sense in my brain, and I like the direction that they headed as a response to Fearless being implemented globally and not just having best of ones. So a lot of good stuff to talk about. If you're excited, let me know down in the comments section below. What are your thoughts on these teams? What are your thoughts on these players? Of course, in this video, I'll be going over all 8 teams in the LTA North. I'll be talking about the advantages and disadvantages that those teams have. I will be power ranking them from number 8 to number 1, and I will also be doing the same for every single player within their position. So it's going to be a big opinion video. Your opinions are likely going to differ from mine, and that's totally fine. Obviously, it's not the end-all, be-all to just look at my rankings and say that everything is perfect. If you have a disagreement, whether it be a team being too high or too low, or an individual player being too high, too low, let me know what that is down in the comments section below. The only caveat that I will give at the start is that if you think a player is too low in their individual position, say I have a player ranked number 4 or 5 in their position and you think they should be top 2 or top 3, let me know specifically the players that you think they're better than. It's all well and good to say that X player is a top 3 jungler in the league, but if there are 4 or 5 players that are competing to be a top 3 jungler in the league, it makes it a lot more difficult to narrow it down. So let me know who you think they are specifically better than and why. I'm always curious to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback down in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's jump into the first part of this video, which is going to be me explaining the format and explaining what's going to be happening here in this spring split for the LTA, because this is the first time they have ever done this. It feels like it's worthy of a slide and an explanation here in the video. For weeks 1 through 3, it is single round robin, best of 1 amongst every single team. So every team will play each other once in a, single round robin style. They're all best of 1s, no best of 3s in this stage just yet. This was supposed to be most of the regular season here in spring, and so I'm glad this is only cut down to the first 3 weeks, but this should establish who is strong out of the gate, who might be an upset candidate out of the gate, and then that transitions us into weeks 4 through 6, which are 2 different groups of 4 with snake seeding. And what that essentially means is that depending on how you do in the best of 1s, you will be seeded into either Group A or Group B. There's no side selection like Group Elder or Group Baron from the LCK or anything like that. It's entirely based on what happens in the first 3 weeks. Group A, which is denoted by the black icons, will be, I believe, seeds 1, 4, 5, and 8. And then Group B, which is denoted by the red icons up on the screen, would be seeds 2, 3, 6, and 7. I believe that that's the way things end up going in a snake setting, but the best of 1s are just to decide who ends up in what group, and the groups are intended to be balanced. And I think they probably will be, especially with such a clear top 4, bottom 4 right now in the LTA. I think that there is a very clear shot that, these groups are relatively obviously balanced. And then once you get into weeks 4 through 6, that's when you get into single round robin best of 3. Each team plays 1 team in their group per week in a best of 3. The 2 teams that are at the top of their group. So if you get first or second in your group, congratulations, you've qualified for the upper bracket of the playoffs. That's the top 4 teams, and they will be the top 4 seeds. They go on to week 7 and they play each other for seeding. So the top seeds from each group will play each other to see who gets the 1 seed. The number 2 teams from each group will play each other to see who gets the 3 seed versus the 4 seed, and then they go into the playoffs in that order. If you are in the bottom 2 of your group in this week 4 through 6 process, you go into a separate qualification best of 3 series where you play the opposite seed from the other group. So if you get 3rd in Group A, you play the team that got 4th in Group B, vice versa. If you get 3rd in Group B, you play the team that got 4th in Group A, and the 2 teams that win those series will be the final 2 teams to qualify for the playoffs as the number 5 and the number 6 seed. So only 2 teams are not going to make the playoffs. It's the 2 teams that end up losing their qualification series after getting bottom 2 in their group. I hope that makes sense. Once we get into playoffs, it's pretty standard. The top 4 seeds, denoted, of course, by the teams that get top 2 in their group, start in the upper bracket, and then the 2 teams that get the 5 and the 6 seeds start in the lower bracket, and at that point, it's your pretty standard standard 6-team double elimination tournament. We've seen a lot of these in LTA history and North American history. We know how those end up going, but getting there I think is relatively interesting. I think, you know, the whole format is pretty balanced. It's not really a circumstance where you're going to feel pretty cheated if you're like the 5th best team, because you're going to be in a group with probably the 4th best team, and you can definitely, you know, cause some upsets in that regard. So I kind of like the format. I like the way things work out. All you have to do is get top 2 in your group to get into the upper bracket of the playoffs, and I think that that is fair. And also, it's best of 3s. It's fearless. That's what we wanted to see here in North America. So I do quite like the format. I certainly think it's better than a lot of the other regions that have really had a lot of bad ones, we'll just say, over the course of this year. Shout out the LCK and the LPL that are just doing whatever they want. It's obviously very funny, but that's the format overview. That's the first, I guess, segment of this out of the way. It's time to get into the actual primer content that you guys know and that hopefully you guys love, because it's time to get into these teams. It's time to get into power ranking them from number 8 to number 1. Again, if you were unfamiliar with the video, we're going to go from number 8 in my power rankings to number 1 in my power rankings, talking about everything you need to know when it comes to each team, their players, their play style, kind of prepping you on what you can expect from them, their ceiling and their floor. And obviously we'll go in depth on each player. Like I said, you know, every player is going to be ranked in their individual position from number 1 to number 8. We'll also show that how that has changed. The big caveat when it comes to that, not every position is created equally. That should be fairly obvious. You know, not every position has the same amount of talent at it. So a player who's number 5 or number 6 in their individual position is not always going to be the same as a player who's number 5 or number 6 in a different position. The individual specifics of those positions and of those players really do matter. And for the most part, this is still kind of a floor ranking. The players that I trust more are going to be ranked higher than the players who I think could theoretically break out, but it's definitely possible, and it will happen, that there's going to be one player that I rank relatively low in these player rankings that ends up breaking out. That's totally expected, and that's totally normal. I'll kind of call out the players that I think that could happen to throughout the video, but that's all the preamble. Let's get into the actual content, starting with the team that I have at the bottom of my power rankings. Coming in at number 8 for me, it is going to be Lyon Gaming, and I really don't want to keep putting this team at number 8, but they have not shown me anything over the course of the year to change my mind. I think a lot of people are going to have Disguised at the bottom of this list, and trust me, we'll get to them in just a few moments, but I think Lyon has bigger weaknesses. Even if I do think their strengths are probably a bit more consistent than Disguised's, I think that Lyon just does not have the firepower to be able to compete with the top teams, even more so than anybody else right now in the LTA, and I think, unfortunately, that comes down to their domestic players, their actual Latin American players who have just not translated well at all so far in 2025. I'll quickly talk about what you're seeing on the screen. Of course, you can see the team name at the top where I personally power rank them, in this case number 8, next to the team name in parentheses. That's going to be how that has changed from my preseason primer before winter to now. I had Lyon at 8 going into the year. I still think they're the number 8 team in the LTA. If that has changed at all, you will see that change denoted in those parentheses. You'll see how they did in terms of the LTA last year. They did not qualify for the playoffs. They were one of the first teams eliminated, one of the first 2 teams eliminated. They didn't get a lot of games. Then, of course, all 5 starters listed across the board here. You will see a number underneath each starter. That is where I personally power rank these players in their position. So a 7 under Licorice means I rank him as the number 7 top laner right now. Again, in parentheses, how that has changed from my winter analysis to now. And so we'll kind of go over whether or not I feel better or worse about individual players when we get there, but let's talk about Lyon. Their lineup, their roster is looking like Licorice in the top lane, Audie in the jungle, Saint in the mid lane, Henna at AD carry, and Lions at support. One last thing, I guess, to say about the format, if you see an asterisk next to a player's name, that just denotes that they are an import and that they are taking up an import slot on the team. You can see it here for Saint and Henna because they are considered imports, but Licorice, Odie, and Lions do not. So let's go ahead and talk about where I think this team's strengths and weaknesses lie. Their strengths are pretty obvious. It's their imports, who are solid players. They are very, very solid players at this level. Both Saint and Henna did impress me in the winter split. Saint was really good in lane. I think had good instincts outside of lane. People have been talking about his upside for a very long time. I kind of pushed back on that as somebody who had watched the LCK Challengers League. I think that there were other mid laners that were maybe a little bit more expressive than Saint. I don't think he was this superstar prospect that could not be denied. There were a couple top lane prospects I definitely liked more, and there was even mid lane prospects I liked more, like Zinni on KT Challengers, that I think created a lot. Saint was a player that I think still had a lot to grow into, and I think that while he still is, you know, an unfinished product, he's definitely better right now than maybe I was anticipating going into the year. He is definitely not a player that needs to work on his macro game. He seems to have a very good idea of what to do and where to go in the mid game. He's already a pretty solid laner, and especially here in the LTA, where I don't think there's a ton of mid laners that are like really good in the 1v1 in mid lane. That's kind of the big exploitable weakness in my opinion. It's why a player like like Quad has been so successful, or Quid has been so successful as well near the top of the standings, is because a lot of the other top mid laners aren't great laners. Saint is a really good laner, and he does have a really good head on his shoulders in that regard, and that's why he is going to jump up to number 5. I just have a really hard time right now projecting him to be better than what is kind of the consistent upper echelon of mid laners at this level. I think that there is a conversation to be had about whether or not Saint, could be number 4 right now. And when you're talking about players that could outperform their ranking, I think Saint is one of the ones I'm really looking at. Like, there is a chance he is just a top 2 or 3 mid laner right now. I just kind of need to see it. I think the production is going to be really low because the rest of this team isn't particularly good, and that doesn't necessarily help your case. But Saint is a good player, and I probably underestimated him coming into the year. Henna is exactly who we thought he was going to be. He's a good AD carry, not a great AD carry at this level. He's pretty solid in the 2v2, and his team fight ability is good enough. Like, he's always been a below average, I would say slightly below average AD carry at the LCK level. That translates into being an average to slightly above average AD carry at the LTA level, and I think that that has translated. The only reason he doesn't come in higher is because I think there are other players with similar skill sets that are just going to have better production this split. Again, I'm not going to spoil who's ahead of him, but I think 6 is a relatively fair ranking. If you wanted him closer to number 5, that's fair. I don't think he breaks into the top 4 just yet, but Henna is a player that I think could be more productive than he was in winter if this team does want to play through bot lane a bit more, which I think is definitely possible with the way that they are constructed. But the imports are definitely the standout positive members for Lyon. Everybody else on this team is a major question mark right now. We'll start with Licorice in the top lane. He just was not good over the course of winter. He was getting obliterated in lane 1v1. It really wasn't a good look for him. His stats are pretty horrendous, and the eye test unfortunately does kind of back that up. He's a very interesting player because I think more so than almost any other top laner or really any other player in the league, he is an entirely vibes-based player. When things are going right for the team and when he's feeling cocky and confident up on the top side, he performs like one of the best players in the region, regardless of role, certainly one of the best top laners in the region. But when things aren't going all that great for the team, when his confidence or his vibes are just shaken up a little bit, when, the rest of the map is losing, he plays like one of the worst top laners in the league. I've never seen a player be so reliant on the success of the rest of his team in order to play well individually, but that's kind of how Licorice has been throughout his entire career. When he's on good teams, he looks good. When he's on bad teams, he looks bad. And unfortunately, right now, I don't think this team is particularly good. So he's going to drop to being my number 7 top laner. I don't think he's going to be particularly good over the course of this split. Top lane's a role that I think has gotten better in the LTA, and Licorice is just not catching up to a lot of the other talent. So he is going to fall a bit, and he is a concern for me. And then you've got the 2 LatAm players coming in to represent Lyon Gaming, Odie and Lions. They just were not good at all. Quite frankly, they were the 2 worst players in the LTA over the course of the winter split, although I think, there are other players that you could throw into the mix in that regard, like Scary Jerry, that just were not particularly productive. But Odie and Lions were just game-losing bad for this team. Odie in particular just has no way to be able to control the map. It feels like he is very clearly the weakest jungler in the LTA North, and that he's not really able to keep up with a lot of the other players at this level, which is disappointing because he has had success internationally against good LTA and LCS junglers in the past, good North American junglers, and that has not translated domestically. I expected him to come in and at the very least be like a slightly below average jungler at this level. That has not been the case. He has been unplayable at times for Lyon, which is disappointing. And you could say the same thing for Lions. Henna's a good laner, but their lane stats are bad because Lions isn't doing anything in the 2v2. I just was really uninspired by the way that he played a lot of the early games. And, he was a player that I already didn't like all that much, even going back to last year when he was playing for Rainbow Seven and, that whole organization. I've never really been that big of a fan of this player. And coming over here to North America, I think it's been exposed even more that he was already probably only a top 3-ish support in LatAm. Now he's definitely a bottom 1 support in North America, and I think that that's definitely an issue for Lyon. And so this is a team with a very clear strength. I think their imports, their carry duo is really strong. Saint and Henna should be on like a borderline top 5, top 6 team in the LTA. I think that that's fair to say. But the rest of this team I just don't believe in, specifically jungle and support, that I just don't think have shown anything at all in the LTA North yet. And honestly, I'm kind of betting against Licorice for 2025 with the direction that I think this team is going to go in. So for now, at the very least, I have this team coming in at number 8, but I guess theoretically they have the upside to get to number 5 or 6 if the carry duo of Saint and Henna can be really good. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and I think the other team that everybody's kind of considering bottom 2 right now, for good reason, is coming in here. It's going to be Disguised, DSG, coming in at number 7 for me in my power rankings. I honestly just thought this team would be better, but there are a couple of players on this team that are not very good right now, or were not good at all in the winter split, that absolutely need to be better. I think that there is a lot of optimism for me that they will get to that point, because, you know, there are a couple of players on this team that have historically just gotten better split over split, and, you know, have faced challenges before and have been able to overcome them, but we'll have to see that actually happen on the Rift before I'm really committing to it happening from day number 1 in spring. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Castle in the top lane, XU in the jungle, Abadaga in the mid lane, Scary Jerry at AD carry, and Huhi at support. Again, pluses and minuses when it comes to this team. When you're looking for the biggest plus for DSG, you know, I think this team compares kind of unfavorably to a team like Lyon, because I think it's basically the opposite here, where it's the carry duo that I think is letting them down, and I think it's the other players on this team that I expect to rise up and really be able to overperform. That specifically top lane. Castle was incredible in the winter split, genuinely a top 2, top 3 top laner in the entire league, especially in terms of statistical production. He was demolishing lanes, and I'm really excited to see the development that he's had over the course of his time. Again, he was on a miserable Immortals team last year that just was not able to generate really any sort of consistency. It was him and Tactical versus the world in a lot of those games, and his laning stats were really good. His individual, you know, performances, I think, were up to par, and I think that's why he did get a job here on DSG, but we weren't sure what we were going to get out of him from a consistency perspective, especially towards the end of summer last year. Things just weren't looking all that good. I think part of that is the team being bad, and, you know, as a top laner, if your team is super out of the playoffs already and there's not really a ton to play for, I can see your laning stats kind of decreasing in that value. The eye test certainly got a lot worse as things went on, but his winter split was exceptionally good. When this team was winning games, when they were staying competitive, it was almost always through Castle, and so I imagine this is still going to be a very top lane focused team, especially because I think you are trying to integrate a young AD carry into the league who just wasn't particularly good in his first stint. So we'll talk about him a bit more later. I also do have confidence in XU. I don't have like a ridiculous amount of confidence in XU, because I want to say, like, one of the things that's always been the case for him as a player, whether it was on Dignitas or whether it was on, you know, Fear last year, is that he thrives with winning lanes. He is always going to be in a better situation when he can play with tempo and when he can play forward on the map, because he really relies on being able to take things away from the enemy jungler, and that just wasn't going to be the case on Disguised in the winter split, where, you know, mid lane was losing hard, bot lane was losing hard a lot in the 2v2, and there really weren't a lot of ways for him to be able to kind of push forward on the map and do the things that he's good at. If one of these lanes gets better, and if top lane is still good, I think that does open up a lot of things for XU. I still think he's a good player, and I still think in the right circumstance he can thrive. I just think it was a really bad situation for him in the winter split. I'm hoping that that gets better. He stays as my number 7 ranked jungler. And then obviously Huhi is somebody who I still think pretty highly of. I get that this bot lane 2v2 wasn't great over the course of winter, but I expect it to not only get better because Scary Jerry's track record of getting better split over split is super consistent, but because I do think that Huhi is a very good support. I think things just weren't comfortable for them, at least in the winter split. They've had a lot more time to practice and play together, and hopefully that does start to increase things. I still think Huhi can be a top-end support at this level if he were in a good situation, so he is going to come in ranked number 5, kind of taking into account that I'm not sure how successful he will be this year, but still believing in the talent and the ability individually of the player. But you can see where the negatives are very clearly with Disguised, and this is where I say they compare very interestingly to Lyon, because it's, again, the opposite. It's the carry duo that I just don't trust here for DSG. Abadaga comes in as my number 8. Mid laner Scary Jerry comes in as my number 8 AD carry. We'll talk about Jerry first, because I was already pretty vocal about Jerry, not only in this segment already, but a lot through Winter Split when we were doing the game-by-game recaps, the series-by-series recaps. He was the one getting done of the series a lot for DSG, because it just was pretty obvious that he was not entirely comfortable or entirely prepared to play his rookie split in the LTA. I hope that that gets better. I believe that that will get better. Again, one of the defining traits for Jerry across his time in Tier 3 and then Tier 2 was that he got better and better game over game, is that he is one of the hardest workers in the entire region, and he's somebody who is going to put in the effort to be able to evolve his game and get comfortable at this level. He was not good day one in Tier 2. People forget Maryville was like an 8th or 7th 7th place team, their first split in the NACL, and then the next year is when they took that gigantic leap when Jerry ended up becoming like an MVP caliber player at the tier 2 level. That is the kind of trajectory you do want to see from him here on DSG. Things need to be better in spring. I'm not expecting them to be perfect, but he needs to be like the 6th best AD carry in the league. Like that kind of needs to be where his trajectory is heading, or I am going to start getting concerned, because he can't be what he was in the, again, very limited sample size of winter because the format was terrible. But, you know, even with that limited sample size, he was not really good in any of the games that he played, and he has a very experienced and successful support playing with him. It's not really that great of a look. He's got to be better than what he was in winter. And then Abadaga, this is a player I probably wouldn't have graded number 8 if I had just gone off of what I remembered from the winter split, but as you guys know, I go back and rewatch a lot of the tape for a lot of these teams going in to making these rankings and making this primer. And man, he was way worse than I remember. His mid lane was awful. He might be the worst 1v1 player in the entire league. Like, he was bleeding resources. He was bleeding a CS differential. Like, he was awful in the winter split. And it just was super unexpected for me because this guy has not really been bad, not only in North America, but in Europe as well. Even coming out of his tier 2 stint last year, he was pretty solid in the ERLs, in the LFL last year. He was a decently successful player. I thought he was going to come over and be like an average mid laner at this level, like he basically always has been. Maybe not the peak version of Abadaga, who could compete for top 3. Like, I didn't expect that was going to be the case with him, but I thought he was going to be able to survive against some of these less experienced mid laners, and that just was not the case. He was awful. He also has to be better. Again, his team fighting is totally fine, and even going back and rewatching his team fights, one of the reasons I didn't notice him being so bad in the winter split when I first watched is because his team fighting was pretty solid, and he does understand where he's supposed to be, and, you know, he is a good player. He has a good head on his shoulders. He's done this a lot of times, but man, those laning stats were just atrocious. And again, I think that is kind of contributing to why DSG has no pressure in the early game. Mid lane is losing hard pretty frequently. Bot lane was losing in the 2v2 pretty frequently. It doesn't really matter if you have pressure on the top side. You need to be able to generate it elsewhere. That's going to be the key to DSG's success. If they are going to be able to get one of those lanes a little bit better, if Abadaga can be the 5th or the 6th best mid laner in the league, if Scary Jerry can be the 5th or the 6th best AD carry in the league, I think you're looking at a team that can compete again for top 5. I don't think that's crazy considering the competition they're going into, but at least with what we've seen, this team maybe has one of the lowest floors out of anybody in the LTA. Then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and talk about a team that shocked a lot of people in a good way in the winter split. It's Dignitas coming in for me at number 6. Some people might have this team higher at number 5. In fact, I think it's going to be pretty common to have this team higher because I think they probably were the 5th best team in the LTA in the winter split in terms of their production. Do I project that going forward? It's kind of hard for me to do so because, again, this is a very limited team, as basically everybody is at the bottom of the standings. They have interesting players, but they don't really have like a full package. But Dignitas has a lot going for them, and again, they played around the things that they do well, very well, over the course of the winter split. So let's go ahead and talk about their lineup, which is looking like Surdy in the top lane, Shaden in the jungle, Kana in the mid lane, Tomo at AD carry, and Isles at support. There is still a lot to like about Dig, even if I am probably lower on their expectations, and even if I do think that what they were in winter is probably not what they're going to be in spring or throughout summer, at least in my opinion. Like, this could still be a playoff team. In fact, I project them to be so, but I don't think they're going to be dominant, and a lot of that is me not trusting bot lane, who I think looked a lot worse than I was anticipating, and quite frankly, needing to see something different out of Surdy. Once again, we're going to have a very similar conversation about Surdy as we had about Scary Jerry, so get ready for that. But we always start with the positives here, and the positive is the mid-jungle duo, the middle of the map for Dignitas, which I think really did click. First of all, Kana was awesome throughout the entire split, whether it was Lyra in and Lyra kind of running it for Dignitas and making the games impossible to win, or when Shaden did eventually come in and start for Dignitas, those two having great chemistry. Kana was one of the most impressive parts of the entire league for me. He's going to come in as a top half mid laner, coming in at number 4, mostly because I do think he actually is just a really good laner. He, unlike a lot of the other players who were, you know, LATAM players last year that came over here to North America, absolutely can translate from a pure mechanical perspective, and I really do think that he can be a near top of the standings type of mid laner. I think he's going to be able to compete with a lot of the upper tier guys if given the opportunity, at least 1v1. Like, I don't think he's all that far off from being quad in terms of what he's able to do individually as a player. Now, do I think he's going to be able to do that with the team he has around him? Probably not. It's a lot more difficult to project that going out into the future, but Kana is definitely the best player on this team. team, or he was in winter, and again, in a very small sample size, I do think he impressed a lot. And I think you could say it's the same thing, if not even more so, about Shaden, who had an even smaller sample size because he wasn't on Dignitas at the beginning of the year. He had troubles getting his visa in at the beginning of the year because of all of the toxicity reports in the investigation over the course of the offseason. He does finally get in here and start playing jungle for the team, and he's way better from day number one than what I was expecting. Obviously, it's not day one for him as a tier 1 player. He played for Evil Geniuses, a very small stint for Evil Geniuses, replacing Armeo a couple of years ago, but this is really his first actual starting job in, tier 1 for North America. He's not really been given the reins to the jungle position, and he came in and looked really good in his small sample size. Again, playing off of Kana, and his success in the middle of the map was paramount for Shaden, and he's a player that has just been such an intriguing player to try and analyze over the course of the last, 4 or 5 years, 3 or 4 years especially, where his good games look tremendously good. He's very flippy, very feast or famine, but when things are on, his mechanical ceiling is insane. And one of the things that I think really is encouraging for me about Shaden is that he does it on champions like Maokai. He does it on champions like Sejuani. I know I kind of harp on this a lot on the channel, but it's all well and good to be able to carry on Viego and, look incredible on champions that are able to get a ton of resources and be main characters for their team. But if you're not able to successfully play Maokai and Vi and Sejuani and, a lot of these facilitators that are super common and necessary to play at a tier 1 level, then you're not going to be a tier 1 jungler. Like, it is the end of the story. You have to be good at those champions in order to be able to play at the tier 1 level. Shaden, I would say, is more comfortable on those champions than he is on a lot of the carries. Not to say he can't play the carries. We know he can, especially going back to his Cloud9 days, but Shaden is a really good player, and I think him and Kana definitely make up the strength of this team. But it's the other two lanes that I am concerned about. I had so many expectations for both Surdy, Tomo, and Isles, or I guess all three of them, going into the year. Surdy in particular, obviously, is a player that a lot of people had expectations for. This guy has been on a fast track to getting to tier 1 through tier 2. Not only was he rank 1 throughout basically all of 2024 on the solo queue ladder, but he broke the ELO record for solo queue in any region ever here in North America. The dude was absolutely demolishing, and he's always found success at other levels. He's destroyed tier 3 in collegiate when he was playing for SLU. He's always been good at tier 2, even when he was playing for bad tier 2 teams, like when he was on Team Liquid first at the beginning end of 2023. He ends up going to Evil Geniuses and salvaging their season, getting them to the finals at the end of 2023. Last year, he gets picked up by FlyQuest and is like MVP in back-to-back stances. This guy has demolished tier 2 for years just by being better than everybody that he's going into. There were major expectations that he was going to be good from day number 1 in tier 1 when he finally was given the opportunity. Unfortunately for him, that wasn't really the case. A lot of beginner nerves, I'll definitely say that. I still expect him to be really good, but he was taking 1v1 trades in situations where he just isn't completely able to outplay his opponent. The Bwipo one definitely comes to mind, where it's just like, you're not playing against, a random top laner in tier 2. All respect to tier 2 top laners, a lot of them are really good, but you're not playing against those guys now. You're playing against a guy who's made world finals before. Like, you have to play a little bit differently, and I think Surdy kind of got a rude awakening in that regard, that he can't just steamroll over everybody that he's playing against in the same way that he did in tier 2. I think he absolutely has the skill set to be able to adapt, but again, I need to see it at the tier 1 level. He was not good at all in winter, and he definitely needs to be better. And then there's Tomo and Isles down in the bot lane. Man, I had high expectations for these two, not only because I think both of them have been good at this level individually before, but because the last time these two played together at the beginning of, I believe, 2024, before Tomo ended up going down to DSG and then getting recalled up for 100 Thieves. That might have been 2023. Somebody in the comments will correct me, but the last time these two were a duo on Dignitas, it was really, really good for them. They were a top 2, top 3 bot lane in terms of the 2v2 in the entire league. They weren't able to carry that over into the late game. Neither of them are particularly good late game players, but Tomo is a super aggressive player with a really, really good laning mentality, and even if he's not always able to translate that into being a 1v9 hyper carry in the back half of the game, sometimes just winning 2v2 is important enough to be able to get your team into a good spot, and Isles is a really good support in the 2v2 as well. That wasn't the case in winter. They were really disappointing as a 2v2, and I think their problems in the late game were even more pronounced than normal. Their ability to skirmish in the mid game was really disappointing for me, and they weren't generating the leads that they were generating the last time they were a duo. The bot lane meta and just the bot lane talent pool in North America has gotten so much better that I think, unfortunately, they've been knocked down quite a few pegs since the last time. I still have hope that maybe they can turn into something, but for now, they're actually getting rather pessimistic grades, and that's kind of a reason that I am lower on Dig, is I just don't think the bot lane is going to be able to recover or be like a star-studded bot lane. They're not the worst in the league, but they're not the best by any stretch. Top lane still has a lot to prove to me, and, Shaden, as good as he was in the small sample size, is a very feast or famine player. Who knows if Kana is still going to be able to be like a top top 4 mid laner. You have guys like Saint and, you know, I'll spoil it, Loki below him that absolutely could be better than him. And if he's not a top 4 mid laner in the league, this is not a top 5 team in the league. I'm sorry, it's just not. He was in winter, and therefore the team ended up succeeding more than expected, but I think there is reason to expect regression from this team with others getting better around the league, and that's kind of why I have them here at number 6. Then moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is what I would consider to be the most interesting of the bottom 4 teams, but once again, I think that there are still real concerns with them, especially after winter. It's Shopify Rebellion coming in at number 5. This is where they came in at the beginning of the year, but trust me, it's a very different number 5 than it was at the beginning of the year. I clumped them and my, at the time, number 4, 100 Thieves into the same tier because I was like, either of them could be a top 4 team. 100 Thieves definitely has more going for them on paper, but Shopify is clearly the best of the rest, right? It felt like a bottom 3 and then Shopify was above that. That is no longer the case. This is a bottom 4 and Shopify is very much a part of that, but at the same time, there is still a lot to like about this roster and about this team. I think that there is a reason to be optimistic about them moving forward, if only because they're actually getting their full roster, the roster that they intended from the beginning of the year to start spring, at least reportedly, and I think that that will help them, and I think that there are some players that are just going to be better than they were in the winter split. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Fudge in the top lane, Contracts in the jungle, Palafox in the mid lane, B-Boy at AD carry, and Seos finally, hopefully, at support. Again, I think that there is a lot to like about this team. The one player who I think was totally fine in the winter split, who I think played up to what my expectations were of him, was Contracts in the jungle. I think he was everything that this team needed him to be. He wasn't the best player. He wasn't the worst player. He was a completely average jungler at the LTA level. He was going to have some games that looked incredible, going to have some games that looked not so incredible. That's Contracts. Like, he was who we know him to be over the course of his career. There really was no difference between what he was in winter of 2025 versus what he has been for NRG or any other team that he's played for over the recent history. So I feel fine about Contracts. I think you're coming in feeling okay about that. I think the other lane that I feel pretty confident is just going to get better is bot lane. And call me an optimist in that regard, but, you know, Zeyzal not being the official starter, not being somebody that this team wanted to run with moving into 2025, I think that definitely hurt their ability to play through bot lane early on in the season. You know, B-Boy didn't have that support that was going to be able to dominate 2v2s with him, and so his lane stats ended up suffering a little bit. But with Seos coming in, I'm just such a fan of Seos individually as a player that I think this bot lane is going to be a lot better, and I think that's going to help not only like the team in general, it's going to help Contracts individually because he's going to have more tempo on the bottom side of the map, and I think it's going to help B-Boy a ton to be able to increase what a lot of people are criticizing in terms of his statistics in the winter split. I still really believe in B-Boy as a player. He still is going to come in above someone like Henna, who was probably better than him in the winter split, but I don't project him to be better moving forward. Again, one of the big reasons why Shopify is above a team like Dignitas, who was likely better than them in the winter split, is because I do think Seos coming in hopefully will stabilize not only the shot calling of this team, because you're actually getting your lineup in here, but will make this bot lane 2v2 an actual strength of this team rather than just not a weakness like it was at times. And Zeyzal wasn't very good for this team, quite frankly. Zeyzal's not as good of a player as Seos. I don't even think I really have to, go deep into that. I think getting him in as the starting support here is definitely a positive, and, hopefully this bot lane does just generally improve with those vibes. But a lot of the negativity, I guess, surrounding this team is going to be coming from the solo laners, and some of that I do agree with. Fudge is going to fall down to number 5 in terms of my top lane rankings. He was not an upper tier top laner at all in terms of what he was in the winter split. He was arguably more of a negative to this team than he was a positive, and I have to hope that that's going to get better. Again, Fudge has been such a successful player in North America for basically his entire tenure here. It's really hard for me to believe that this is a guy that's just going to be bad now that he's not on Cloud9. I think there still is so much to tap into there for Fudge, and I think the encouraging thing, even if it is the concerning thing at the same time, is that the problems for Fudge were all individual. It was him losing 1v1 and him making mistakes on the top side of the map, him being susceptible to ganks and, just not necessarily respecting the opponents that he was going into. The reason that's both a good and a bad thing is, first of all, it's a bad thing because he was the one losing. It was his mistakes that were costing them, and that means that you can't really blame it on anybody else. It's not like there's a ton on tape in winter by itself to indicate that he's going to get better and that he got unlucky or anything like that in the winter split. It was kind of him that was screwing up. But at the same time, it's encouraging because it's not the team letting him down. It's not one of those situations where it doesn't matter if Fudge gets better. The team is always going to be in a bad spot and is not going to be able to enable him. I don't think that that's the case. If Fudge can just be what he was before Winter Split, like what he has been for Cloud9 over the course of his whole career, this is immediately going to change what Shopify is as a team. They're going to be a lot closer to being top 4 than they are to being bottom 4. And I think that that is hopefully where things go. Again, a lot of the pivot point of this team is, in my opinion, on Fudge to be able to course correct on the top side of the map, which I think is possible. And then the lowest rated player on this team, it's gotta be Palafox in the mid lane. Man, the fall off has been really dramatic for him as a player, and it's not just the 2023 version that went to the quarterfinals of Worlds. Like, that's not the only version of Palafox that I'm saying the fall off is from. I was hyping this guy up a ton, obviously when he was a prospect, when he was in both Cloud9 and Optic system, long time ago, but when he finally got an opportunity in the LCS many years ago, I thought that he was a lot better than people were giving him credit for. He never really got a stabilized job, and he ends up getting it on CLG or on Energy, and, obviously that ends up really working out. Like, he ends up, being one of the better mid laners in the entire region. The mechanical ceiling is super high. He plays assassins at a really high level, and in those metas where you can play a lot of melee mid laners, it ends up working out really well for him. He goes to the quarterfinals of Worlds, and I would say that was the peak, but, he was a player that I was calling an all-pro the year before he ended up going to Worlds, when Energy, or I guess CLG, was still kind of an up-and-down team. Like, Palafox was a player I was already hyping up to an extreme degree in that regard, and I think 2023 was just kind of a culmination of what I thought was the building of Palafox as one of the better, like, domestic mid laners, but 2024 onwards, that has completely crashed down back to earth. Like, he has been the worst version of himself. I think last year was the worst year of his career at the top level, and I think this year is even worse so far. Winter was not good at all from him. He ranks in as my second to last mid laner in the league, and right now, he's got to be playing for his job. Like, there are other mid laners that are promotable right now in tier 2 that I think would be an upgrade to Palafox. There are other mid laners in other regions that I think would be an upgrade to Palafox, and so I think there is still a lot on the line for him to, kind of prove that he deserves to be in this team. But again, that slow and steady decline is not ideal. I don't think that it's his meta, like the mid lane, Akali, Silas, like, assassin meta, it's LeBlanc. Like, that's not really the standout thing right now. And I don't think he's nearly as good on a lot of the other champions. I think that has been proven recently, and his stats don't look all that great. Again, a lot of this is the eye test to say that he's been worse because he's had stats like this before, but the eye test has never looked this bad. I do not believe in Palafox, and he's going to need to be better. But if mid lane is the only position that's underperforming, if bot lane ends up getting better, if jungle continues to be, for the most part, a positive for this team, and if Fudge can especially get back on track, there is still a world where Shopify is closer to top 4. Right now, I'm not betting on that. I think that they are very clearly in the bottom 4, but at least in terms of upside, it's basically impossible with what I project for me to rank this team anywhere below number 5. Then moving on to number 4 in my power rankings, and like I have said throughout basically the entirety of this video, it really is like a top 4, bottom 4, like a 1/2 divide in the LTA right now, where I think the top 4 teams are all competitive, and I think the bottom 4 teams are not, but that means that the top 4 teams can really be put in any order that you want. For me, it's going to be the consistency that I rank them on and just my personal expectations for the team, and that's why coming in at number 4, it's going to be Cloud9. It's basically impossible to put this team higher than this, at least in terms of my grading scale right now. There's a ton to like about what Cloud9 is, and when you look at these player rankings, I don't even think this is indicative of where the issues and the problems on this team are, because the players that are ranked high are at times issues for this team, and the players that are ranked low in terms of their individual positions, I think are kind of the glue pieces that put the team together. But at the end of the day, there is something wrong with Cloud9 in terms of how they play their mid and late games that just enables them to not stay competitive with teams that know what they're doing in that stage, and until that gets fixed, they're not going to be a top 2 team like they should be. So let's go ahead and talk about that. Their lineup is looking like Thanatos in the top lane, Blabber in the jungle, Loki in the mid lane, Sven at AD carry, and Vulcan at support. Again, as per usual, we get the good out of the way first. They very clearly have the best top laner in the league, in my opinion, in Thanatos in terms of individual skill. Like, I think you could make the argument that Bwipo is the most valuable top laner in the league, and if you wanted to make that argument, it's totally fine. People would have made that argument about Impact going into the year. In fact, I had Impact at number 1 going into the year. It's not Impact. He was awful in Winter, despite the fact that Team Liquid was doing well. We'll talk about him a bit more later, but in terms of just raw talent and who I think is elevating their team the most, Thanatos is the best top laner in North America right now. I think he has very much cemented himself near the top of that. Not only has his development kind of apexed at the start of this year, but I think it was a natural curve, which is why I think it's pretty sustainable for him. He was always a player that needed to work on a few things coming over to North America. I talked about that a ton before he got signed up by Cloud9 last year, where, his laning stats were really good in the LCK Challengers League, but you go and watch his team fighting and it was, questionable. We'll just say it certainly wasn't consistent in any stretch. He wasn't a very good late game player, and that was something he needed to get better at. He wasn't good at cooperating with the the rest of his team, and I wasn't sure how that was going to work moving over to a region that he's never played in before, where, presumably he's not like an expert in the language. He obviously speaks English now, as we know through a lot of the Cloud9 like podcast, things going out there, but, his development I think has been so steady and so normalized, and he's gotten better in the areas that he needs to get better in. Like, yeah, this guy's the number one top laner now. His laning is still incredibly effective. He's clearly the best laning top laner in the entire league. I don't even think that's up for debate, but, his weakness at the time was his ability to translate those leads into late game pressure. He's gotten really good at that, and especially he's gotten good at playing off of mid lane, which I'm really impressed by. Hopefully Thanatos is going to be able to keep it up. I have a feeling that he will. This guy is as good as advertised. And then Vulcan's the other player that I think is pretty undeniable on this team. People will criticize this bot lane because Sven is not a particularly good 2v2 player, and their 2v2 stats are not great, but Sven is not a 2v2 player. Like, I think if you're trying to evaluate Sven based on how he's doing in the 2v2, you're not accurately identifying what he is good at in the first place. Vulcan is just good at every stage of the game. You need him to be good in the 2v2. We've seen him do that with multiple different AD carries in the past, but what he is really great at is the mid game. He's probably the best mid game player in the LTA, like full stop. He just knows where he's supposed to be. He knows how to generate leads, not only for Blabber, but specifically for Loki in the jungle. He knows how to be able to make things, move forward and how to play off of his mid laner really well. I think if this guy were on a team that was more consistent around him, he would pretty clearly be considered the number one support. He was the number one support last year, and I think there was nothing in winter to dissuade that thought for me. Again, people are going to hype up Core JJ and say that he should be number one. I think that's totally fair and totally valid. If you want Vulcan at number two, I really have no criticisms with that. I'm sure there are already people in the comments that have typed that out, but for me, Vulcan's going to stay at number one because he didn't do anything to kind of not earn it. He definitely was up there in terms of his performances in the winter split, even if the rest of his team at times was inconsistent. And, ironically enough, again, another player that I feel okay about is Loki in the mid lane, and he's the player that comes in the lowest in terms of his individual player grade. Would Loki be good on a team that is less mechanically talented? No, I really don't think so. He is a very one-dimensional player in terms of what he does, but that one dimension is helpful for a team like Cloud9. He is willing to give over any resource that he needs. We talked about this a lot in the preseason primer when, I was kind of evaluating what he was in the Challengers League. This is not a hyper carry player. This is not a guy who's going to 1v9 a lot of games. He's going to try to play within the system. He's totally fine sacrificing resources in order to make his jungler's life a lot easier, or his top laner's life, or his bot laner's life, whatever, like a lot easier. He's willing to play for the team, and, I think that can sometimes hide his mechanical we'll just say his lack of mechanical upside. I think he's a fine mechanical player. I just don't think he's ever going to be exceptional in that regard, but his role on this team is very defined, and I think he filled that out really well in the winter split. It's exactly what we thought it was going to be, and I think he is an asset to this team, regardless of whether or not I think he would be successful outside of this team. Like, if you, switched him and Kana, do I think he would be successful on Dignitas? No, I really don't. I don't think he's the kind of player that would be able to, be good on a bad team, but he is good for a good team. That's kind of the player that Loki is, and then you've got Blabber and Sven, and these conversations are much more difficult to have. We'll start with Sven because Blabber really is the big topic when it comes to this team. Sven is what he is. I like Sven. I think he is a valuable asset to have, but I don't know if you like Sven when you already have a player like Loki on the team, or, I think you could say the same thing. Like, I don't know if you love having Loki on the team when you already have someone like Sven. Sven is not an early game player. His laning stats are never going to be all that good. He's really not all that good in the 2v2. We saw that when going up against the top tier AD carries, the top three guys who were all just way better in lane than Sven was. He's just a super consistent team fighter. Like, he is built in the mold of Teddy or of like a prime Patrick or a player like that, where you sacrifice laning phase, it's gonna, aiming I think is another relatively fair comparison. Obviously he's worse than, a lot of these players. I think he's around the skill level of Teddy, but he's a player that's never going to be a main character. He really shouldn't be a main character. He's not going to be a star in lane, and he is going to be successful in team fights without resources, but that means those resources have to go somewhere else. Right now, I think they should go to Thanatos, but it opens up the door for Blabber being way more important for this team, and as has been properly pointed out in my comment section before and on this channel in terms of the recaps, Blabber is just not a consistent primary option. He really has never been. When his MVP seasons were rolling around in 2020, a lot of those were because his laners were benefiting so much from having Blabber be so good on things like Gragas in the jungle, from things like Maokai in the jungle. He's always been really good at that role. My issue with Blabber is that he just gets super greedy. There's going to be one or two plays, every couple of games that he just throws away a big section of his lead because he's trying to, take his lead 2x ahead. And sometimes that works. Sometimes it is really effective, but I think the talent pool is too large in the LTA right now to get away with that consistently. If Blabber is going to play like an MVP, this is a top 1 or a top 2 team in the LTA. LTA. Like, full stop. It is entirely on him, but he wasn't that in winter. He really wasn't that in 2024, even if I think he was way better than he gets credit for. This is a guy that needs to be the guy for Cloud9, and I know that feels obvious, but he's the franchise player for a reason, and if he's not going to be able to step up and be the number one option on a team where the mid laner is much more supportive and the AD carry is much more supportive, that's going to be a problem. Now, if Thanatos just pops off and destroys every single game, like, that's awesome. Maybe you can just play through top lane every single time, but the responsibility of Blabber on this team is ginormous, and until he steps up and proves that he can handle that, Cloud9's going to struggle. Their mid games have been bad. Their shot calling has been bad. They need to be able to find some semblance of consistency, because it feels like right now it's a bunch of decent players with decent skill sets that do not gel together, and that's why, even though they are an upper tier team, and I think it's pretty clear that they are an upper tier team, they're just not able to crack that top 3 where I think everybody else has a much more defined way to win. Then moving on to number 3 in my power rankings, and this is where I think you start to get to teams that genuinely have a lot of cases to be made that they deserve to be number 1 in terms of these power rankings, but for me, coming in at number 3, maybe shockingly, it's going to be 100 Thieves. They're only going to be number 3. I think some people are going to clearly have this team in the top 2, but like I said, this is all a projection from this point onwards. I think the top 4 teams are all very similar in terms of what their upside is. I think it's all just about trying to weigh the downsides on these teams, and I think unfortunately for 100 Thieves, their downsides are still larger, in my opinion, than the top 2 teams, so I just have more long-term faith in to be able to consistently be able to figure it out. That being said, this team was one of, if not the most productive team in the LTA in winter for a reason. They have so much going for them. Their carry duo is incredibly good. I just have questions about some of the other players on this team, so let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Sniper in the top lane, River in the jungle, Quid in the mid lane, FBI at AD carry, and Ayla at support. Let's get the good out of the way first. Quid is a monster. He is the best player in the entire region. I have him graded as the best player in the entire region now. He is above Inspired, who I think was fine, you know, like good enough in the winter split to not like completely ruin his ranking, but he wasn't a superstar. Quid has been nothing less than a superstar ever since Doublelift left 100 Thieves a couple of years ago. He obviously got brought into a situation where he was not going to receive any resources, where DL was going to be strong side bot lane, as he has always been at the tier 1 level. Obviously things are changing a bit in tier 2 now, but, you know, Quid was kind of taken out of his comfort zone. The moment Doublelift ends up leaving, the team ends up focusing more on him as a primary carry. The organization invests a lot into him, and he pays it out tenfold. He has been extraordinarily good. I'm all in on the Quid train. I think he would be a top, you know, 4 or 5 mid laner in almost any region in the world. Maybe not the LCK, like that's the only one, but he would be arguably a top 3 or 4 mid laner in the LPL. He would definitely be a top like 1 or 2 mid laner in the LEC right now. Like, that's the talent level that Quid has mechanically speaking, and he knows how to carry games. He is a primary option. He is like a number 1 guy. He is an MVP frontrunner. This guy is going to be an MVP frontrunner every single time he receives resources, and that's why he comes in as my number 1 mid laner. I did not have to think about this. Again, he ranks as my highest player in the LTA, and the other player that obviously kind of re-broke out in the winter split, FBI in the bot lane. I don't know how many people here have been around for a couple of years, but boy does it feel good to have been an FBI defender over the course of his entire career. I have gone to bat for this guy over and over again in long form comment sections, and obviously people who have been watching me since especially like 2023 will definitely vouch for that, but crazy to see him re-break out here on 100 Thieves. This guy was the best performing AD carry outside of one, I would say, in the entire league. He was a top 3 to 5 player in the LTA in the winter split. If he's going to be able to keep that up, that's incredible. And quite frankly, there's no reason to believe that he can't. He's always been a really dynamic player. He's worked on becoming a lot more of a well-rounded AD carry. He came into the league with Golden Guardians as an import, I guess a quote-unquote import from Australia, because they don't take him an import slot, but he came in as an OS player and, you know, was expected to be a really good laner from day number 1. And he was, but he threw away a lot of games in team fights. So what does he do? He starts becoming a lot more of a, you know, team fight focused player. He actually puts a lot of attention into becoming less of a lane focused player. They draft, you know, scaling lanes, and they start playing for team fights, him and Huki, and they end up being really good in that role on 100 Thieves when that team is going to a bunch of championships, you know, playing with some really good players. And that's awesome. And now that he's back on 100 Thieves, you know, after a stint on Evil Geniuses, flashes. It feels like the whole package has come together. He's great in lane, definitely one of the best laning bot laners, easily the second best in the entire league, and then he's one of the best team fighters now as well. He's just a super consistent player. There's no real weakness in his game. He obviously really loves playing for this organization where he's had a ton of success over the course of his career. Quid and FBI are arguably the scariest carry duo in the league, and in fact, I would probably consider them the scariest carry duo in the league, and I think that that is the big advantage for 100 Thieves. And it's not like River is like a down negative note, we'll just say, in the jungle. River is excellent. Do I think he's top 2? I think there's an argument with Blabber being super inconsistent right now, but can I say that River is a better player than Blabber? I have a hard time being able to make that claim. I think he has very much staked his claim as the number 3 jungler in North America, and that's a really good place for him to be. He's really settled into a nice role of being a facilitator for Quid in particular, but spent a lot more time bot lane than he typically does last year, or last split for FBI, so generally, River's just great for this team. He has the perfect playstyle for what they're looking for out of a mid bot lane, focused carry type of team, and I think he's obviously really good for 100 Thieves, even if he's not been as good as he was like in his prime as a carry player. I think that there are definitely still some mistakes. He gets out jungled by the really good junglers as we've seen throughout his career, but there aren't a ton of super successful junglers at the LTA level that are super consistent from a game-to-game basis, so you're happy to have River. And then Ayla was excellent, quite frankly, in the winter split. He was everything you could have asked for, and then some. Obviously, FBI and Ayla, two former, country mates coming out of Australia. Ayla has always been a player with a ridiculous amount of potential. He's just really struggled to be able to unlock it consistently. The flashes have been there. I have praised Ayla a lot on this channel and certainly defended Ayla in the comment section, not only last year on 100 Thieves when I think he was a lot more important to that team than he got credit for. I talk all the time about how he was the most important player in their win over Cloud9 that qualified them for Worlds. I still believe that when you go back and rewatch that series, that he was by far the best player on the Rift there, but, he's kind of won everywhere he's gone. The FlyQuest situation was a disaster, not really his fault. He basically had no time to get his bearings under him for that team because he came in mid-year, and was immediately asked to be the primary shot caller for the team. Not a great situation. And Evil Genius has super overperformed expectations when he was on that team. So Ayla's track record is shockingly good, and this is a guy who's been an MVP at the tier 2 level before. I believe in Ayla. Now, I still got to see the consistency because the problem has not been his good games. He's always had good games, but the consistency has been an issue. He was a top 1 or top 2 support in the LTA last split. If he's going to be able to keep that up, he's going to continue to rise in these rankings. The only player I have any concerns about when it comes to 100 Thieves is still Sniper on the top side. I'm really just not that big of a Sniper believer. This guy is not a particularly dominant laner. His mechanics are good, but they're not exceptional. I still think there's a lot of growing to do in terms of the decision making. Like, you can win through Sniper, and he's going to have some really good games, but it's so frustrating when I sit here and say that, like, 2024 Spring, his rookie split, is by far the best he has ever looked as a player. Summer last year, he was a weakness. He almost cost this team a chance to go to the World Championships, which would have been a disaster. He goes to Worlds and is one of the worst players at the World Championships. And then you look at how he played in Winter, and it's like, all right, well, the team's winning, but they're basically completely ignoring him. Like, I just don't believe in Sniper as a top-tier top laner right now. Could he get there? Maybe. Like, it's just hard for me to imagine that there is a world where this team wouldn't be better off having Castle or, even someone like Fudge on the top side of the map. I think that there are other top laners that would be upgrades to this team, quite frankly, right now, and I think Sniper I'm worried about the upside. I think the floor is fine. Like, at times it can be really bad, like game to game it can be really low, but over the course of a season, his floor is relatively fine. He's going to give you an okay output, but you're not asking him to be good enough to be the 5th or the 6th best top laner in the league. You need him to be a top 3 guy because this team wants to win the LTA, and I just have a hard time believing he's ever going to get there. Prove me wrong. Please, please, please prove me wrong. A lot of people kind of, go back and look at rankings that I do from many months ago or years ago, and they're like, you're an idiot for having this player here. I love when I'm proven wrong. I love when a player overperforms my expectations or when a team overperforms my expectations. I'm hopeful that that can be the case for Sniper, but this is just kind of where I'm at in terms of him right now. I think that there are some concerning traits. Sniper's not an elite top laner, and Ayla's consistency has not really been tested, but the core 3 of this team is so strong that you have to consider them in the same tier as the upper 2 teams here. But that's going to bring us to number 2 in my power rankings, and this is a team that finished a lot worse than second in the winter split, but I just have too much faith that they're going to be able to figure it out. It's FlyQuest coming in at number 2 for me. This was a team I had at number 1 in my power rankings going into the year. They obviously did not live up to that expectation, but every piece of why I liked this team at the beginning of the year is still here, and quite frankly, it was there in the winter split. It just didn't come together for success and actual victories. I think when you take what they had and push it like a slight level further, that's where you get the best team in the league, and I think that that absolutely is still there. There are some inconsistencies that are naturally going to work themselves out in a format that has way more games, and I think that that will benefit FlyQuest. I think this team is going to be just fine. That's my projection, but let's go ahead and talk about why their lineup is looking like Bwipo in the top lane, Inspired in the jungle, Quad in the mid lane, Masu at AD carry, and Busio at support. You can't really start the conversation about FlyQuest without starting with Inspired. At least in my opinion, he still is the guy here, and I get that maybe some people have soured a bit on Inspired because he wasn't dominant. He wasn't like completely tearing teams apart in the winter split, but he still was really, really good for this team. I think underratedly good for this team. He was actively driving them forward, and quite frankly, he just wasn't the main character. There were a lot of games that they played through mid lane and a lot of games that they played through bot lane, which is not what they were doing a lot of in the previous year. They kind of changed up their style in that way. Inspired wasn't relied upon as much to win a lot of team fights in the later part of the game. There are some detractors, some naysayers that will tell you that Inspired's lack of ability to play for early game skirmishes is going to hurt him on this map, and that what we saw in winter is probably more indicative of who he will be moving forward, but I still think there is a second gear for him to get into, and the first gear was still really good. He still was probably the best jungler in the LTA in the winter split. He just wasn't overwhelmingly the best player in the LTA like he has been previously. I have faith that Inspired's going to be able to get back, and that is a big reason why FlyQuest is still in the top 2 in terms of my rankings. I think Inspired will be able to show his, differential in terms of these jungle matchups, because to me, he is like one by himself at the top of the jungle rankings. And then I think the other player who was just really freaking good in winter was Quad. And quite frankly, I've just been too harsh on Quad, and I'm willing to say that. I have been too hard on a player that I really liked many years ago, back in 2022 on DRX on this channel, and then, I've just soured on over and over again. I got to see the problems with Quad's game over his time in the LCK, and so when he came over to North America, I was really critical and harsh on his ability to be able to utilize the things he was bad at in Korea in North America, but he doesn't have to be a perfectly complete player in order to be super valuable at this level. Is he resource heavy? Yes, he is a resource heavy player. Can he carry games? Absolutely, he can carry games. He can be a primary option for the team, and quite frankly, he was the primary option in the winter split. He moves up pretty clearly to be my number 2 mid laner, and that's with the guy who already was my number 2 mid laner having a really good split, in my opinion, and really impressing me. The top 3 guys, I think all were really good. You know who the top 3 are. They're the, top 3 in terms of the teams in these power rankings, but Quad really impressed me to the point where he has to be considered top 2 at the bare minimum. If I didn't like Quid as much as I do, Quad would probably be number 1. He's like an A- caliber player at this level. Really valuable to have him. Everybody else on the team has their pluses and minuses. Masu and Busio are who they are as a bot lane. Masu still has the potential to be like an arguable number 1 guy here, but he's basically the opposite of what the other 2 guys are. It's funny because I do think the top 3 AD carries are also kind of separated right now. They're all, better than I think everybody else in terms of their grouping, but they're all one dot on the spectrum that is early game versus late game, where when you look at the early game side of it, it's Yon, and he's able to dominate 2v2s and really take over in that way. When you look at the late game side of it, it's Masu, who's a really great team fighter and somebody who's super consistent in the back half of the game, but isn't the best at being able to dominate 2v2s in that same way. And then the middle dot between those 2 is FBI. It's really funny to kind of see how specialized all 3 of the top 3 AD carries are and how they all win through different ways, but Masu is really, really good in the team fight stage of the game. If he can really develop in the early game and in the 2v2, or if this team just starts giving him more resources, can he be number 1 in terms of these AD carry rankings? He could be the number 1 player in the LTA. He has that kind of potential. There's a reason this team has really invested a lot into him, but that just hasn't been there. He's been a less consistent laner, more consistent team fighter, which I think personally right now I value a little bit less than great laner, inconsistent team fighter. So Masu comes in at number 3, but again, top 1 potential for him. And then there's Busio in the support position. I think he's really settled into who he is as a player. First of all, he's an engaged player, not somebody who you really want to play anything else. Like, he's not an enchanter player. He's not somebody who really needs to play like gigantic playmakers. Get him on Rakan, get him on Leona, get him on Nautilus, let him do his thing. Like, that's what he's good at. I think we've learned that that's who he is, but also I think he's really settled into the spot of being that like half a step down from elite, right? Like, he's not an elite support, and I don't think think he's ever gonna be an elite support at this level. I think that's just where I've landed on Busio. I don't know if I see that kind of upside in him anymore, but he is certainly better than like the average to slightly above average supports at this level. Like he's a full tier above those guys. So do I think he's like an MVP candidate? No, I don't think he'll probably ever be an MVP candidate, even if he is like a top support in the league. But I think he's certainly good enough for you to be able to win with, and he does fit well with the rest of this team, especially because Masu does want to play for team fights. You know, picking things like Nautilus and Leona, they're good for being able to set up for that in the future. And the last player we have yet to talk about here is Bwipo on the top side. Bwipo is Bwipo. Like, honestly, what conversation do we even need to have about him at this point? He is the exact same player he has been the entirety of his career. He is super unstable, super feast or famine on the top side. You have no idea what you're going to get out of him from a game-to-game basis. He could be 0-6 and completely lose your team the game, or he could be 0-6 and completely win your team the game. Like, it's just the way that it goes with Bwipo. You don't really know what you're going to get out of him, and he's willing to sacrifice a lot of resources in order to get theoretical good plays. Sometimes that's good. It cost them a lot in the winter split where he was just bleeding resources on the top side of the map against good teams. Again, if he locks it in a little bit, and especially if he just starts winning 1v1s, which he already was doing in the winter, but if he's going to be able to do that more consistently, or if he's going to be able to get to the late game more consistently, then yeah, he's going to be just fine. And if Inspired has an MVP type of season, if Quad has an MVP type of season, which I think is possible, then you're looking at FlyQuest as a team that very easily could be the #1 team in North America. But there are some question marks with how things ended in winter, which is what's keeping them out of the top 1 for me. Hopefully Masu can develop into that superstar. Hopefully Bwipo can, like, get that consistency up, I think is the way I'll put it. But at least for now, I just can't justify putting them below #2. I expect them to be better than they were a couple of months ago. But that's going to bring us to my #1 team in my power rankings, and it is going to be the defending champions. It is going to be Team Liquid coming in at #1. I get it. This team did not perform the way that you wanted them to perform internationally. At first stand, if they had picked up 1 win against either CFO or Top Esports, they would have made the top 4, and honestly, they probably should be in the finals of that tournament, especially looking with how things ended up going. I'm not saying that they were a top 2 team or anything at that tournament, but if K-Corp can make the finals, Team Liquid could have made the finals. Like, I certainly believe that. I certainly believe that that was on the table for them, but they just didn't get the job done. They didn't step up when it mattered the most. In fact, they let their team down when it mattered the most, and I think that that is concerning for me. But again, North American teams coming back from big international tournaments, historically very successful, and I don't really expect that to be different here for Team Liquid. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Impact in the top lane, in the jungle, APA in the mid lane, Yon at AD carry, and Core JJ at support. There's really no way to start talking about Team Liquid other than Yon. I said earlier that Quid was the highest graded player in the LTA for me. He shares that grade with Yon, and quite frankly, Yon is the #1 player in North America. You know, Quid's very good, and I think in terms of production, he will likely be at the top of the standings, but Yon is the best and most talented player in North America, and I don't even think it's really that up for debate anymore. This guy just does everything that you would want him to do. He's developed a ton as a late game team fighter, which was always his weakness. He wasn't super consistent in the back half of games. That's why he struggled at Worlds in 2023 before he really broke out, because he was being asked to play these 40-minute games with Pioshik in the jungle, and it wasn't necessarily working out for him. But the moment they realized they could just index into dominating the bot lane 2v2 every game, no matter what, that's when Yon just was unstoppable at this level, and this guy breezed through the playoffs. When you're talking about a playoff MVP for winter, it was Yon. When you're really talking about an entire split MVP, it was Yon, and it wasn't really that up for debate. Yon was incredible for Team Liquid, and he is the #1 AD carry. He is the #1 player. He's the best laner in the West, and he continues to hold that title. He obliterated Kalist in NK Corp, and I get that things were different for KC at the beginning of that tournament, but like, that's not an insult to Kalist. That is a credit to Yon and how good he is as a player. Yeah, did he show up in the big moment? I don't think he was the problem, but you could argue that he was. Like, I think that there is a conversation to be had there, but domestically, Yon's #1, and it's not close. And Core JJ, I think he's playing better right now than he did at any point last year, and this team broke out last year. Core was really awesome in the winter split. He did everything he was supposed to do, and like I said, I think the bot lane played even better in winter than they did in 2024, and I was already calling Yon the best AD carry in North America in 2024. Core was absolutely ridiculous in winter, and if you want him at #1, put him at #1. I have no qualms at that. If him and Vulcan, I think, were both exceptional. Core was probably more impressive in winter, but I think Vulcan's track record last year was a little bit better. Whatever you want to do here, I think it's fair. They're 1A, 1B in terms of the best supports in North America right now, and Core definitely definitely deserves to be considered elite once again. It really was just last year where I was like, he's not that great of a laner. He's always been much more of a roamer. Throw that out the window. He clearly worked on his laning in the offseason, and now he's actually really good in that role. So credit to Core, he was exceptionally good. And quite frankly, I think APA was also really good for this team. I feel so bad dropping him one spot because I had him at number 2 at the beginning of the year, and now I'm moving him to number 3, even though he did everything he was supposed to do in winter. It just is the way that it goes. Quad was too low. He should have been number 3 from the start, and I'm kind of course correcting that now. But APA is still exceptional. He's a better laner domestically than people give him credit for. Internationally, I think there are some real concerns with whether or not he's going to consistently be able to hold up against like the best talent in the world, but domestically speaking, like his laning stats are perfectly fine. They're actually completely average, and he is a phenomenal team fighter. He's a really good shove and roam player who's willing to play for jungle, and man, can he like take over in a side lane. Like this guy just understands the macro part of League of Legends. He understands the mental part absolutely of League of Legends. He is a very well-rounded player, much more so than he gets credit for, and I was really impressed by his tape. I think he is clearly in the upper echelon of mid laners here in the LTA, and I feel even more confident about that now than I did going into the year. He has shown everything he is supposed to show, but the top 2 players of this team have their concerns. Umtees have been very well documented. He comes in as my number 4 jungler, I should say. He's not the most consistent player in the world, but he is a player that did step up in the important games when it mattered the most. He's very streaky. He's going to have some games where he's just not very good, and quite frankly, if he doesn't win in the early game, he's not going to be really all that reliable for you as a player. I think that that's always going to be his downside. That was his downside in the LCK. It's still his downside here in the LTA. He gets away with it more because he can win super consistently, but this team's always going to be better when he's on Sejuani and Maokai. I think that's just going to be the case. I think they realized that towards the end of the split when he was playing a lot of that in the playoffs, when they stopped forcing him onto playmakers and started letting him just be a facilitator for these other players that can take over games. I think things got a little bit better. Umtee's not a bad player, but he is an average player at this level, which I think is something that could hold Team Liquid back from being number 1. And I think the other thing is impact on the top side. Look, I hate to continue to drill down this point that I've said over and over again on this channel every time we've talked about impact, but the first year impact curse is real, where the first year on a new organization, the guy is incredible. He is an all-pro MVP caliber player. He is a legend of the game his first year on a new organization. He goes on the same org for a second year, things get worse. It's every org that he's been on. It happened on Team Liquid the first time he was here. It happened on Evil Geniuses very clearly, where he was awesome when he first left and wasn't quite as good in year 2. He didn't get a chance to do it on FlyQuest, and it's happening right now again on Team Liquid. It's crazy how year 1 is always so good for impact, and then year 2 is always worse, but he was not good in the winter split. He wasn't even good on weak side. He was actively bleeding resources, a lot more than people are giving him credit for. He got mega exposed at first stand. He was like the worst player at that tournament. It was really horrific. Like, there is so much that needs to be worked on from Impact, and this is a guy who's pretty historically been kind of an international underperformer, at least in his time in North America after he left T1 or SKT back in the day. I like Impact, and I can't rank him below number 3 because he was an MVP caliber player last year. He came in at number 1 at the start of the year, but he did not play like a top 3 top laner in the winter split. And if you're going to be able to take advantage of Team Liquid, it's going to be through top and it's going to be through jungle. And I kind of firmly believe that. Mid lane is also kind of exploitable if you're in a really good matchup. He's not a top 2 mid laner, in my opinion. The problem is they probably have the best player in the LTA in Yon, and their bot lane is exceptional. APA has been really good at being able to stabilize in matchups against players that theoretically should be better than him. He was way better than Quid in the finals when they swept them. Umtee steps up in big moments, and you have to just hope that Impact can survive on the top side, or maybe he gets some of that form back. I just am not necessarily counting on that right now. Team Liquid is a beatable team. They're not a far and away number 1 like we've talked about with some of the other regions, but they are definitely a team that I think, coming off of a championship, coming off of getting some international experience playing against teams like HLE and, K-Corp and Hanwha Life and CFO regularly in scrims, like they should be able to come back domestically and be able to show that they're number 1. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LTA North Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. I hope you guys enjoyed. There are going to be some disagreements with my rankings. Again, I kind of just went with my gut for the top upper echelon of teams, and even really the bottom of the rankings. Like, a lot of these teams are in groups rather than like clear number 1 or number 2, and you could say the similar thing about players. So let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. I'm always curious to know where you guys agree, where I'm kind of against the grain in terms of what public opinion opinion is and where I think, I am kind of on the grain where public opinion is. I don't really have a great understanding always of what other people are thinking. I can just kind of go off of my own thoughts. And so let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. And it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We'll cover every single game of the LTA North over the course of this entire split on this channel. We've already been covering the LEC, the LPL, the LCK, the NACL Tier 2 right here in North America on this channel. If you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all